Our final panel today is going to look at the future of rules-based trade practices, okay? And specifically, what is going on to the rules-based international trade? Our moderator today is our own Managing Director, Steve Paley. So you've heard Steve already, but you don't know who he is, so I'm going to introduce him. He is a graduate of our law school, and he serves as an adjunct professor where he teaches the students of the Canada-United States Law Journal, and he also directs independent studies and focused research projects that we engage in under CUSLI. As a student here, Steve was very involved with the Canada-United States Law Institute. He organized the student advocacy competition, and he was greatly involved in setting up the projects. So after graduation, Steve joined Ernst & Young, and he did people advisory services and assurance services. He is now a compliance director at Charles Schwab, supporting the firm's retail wealth management advisory business. He also led the compliance risk assessment function that encompassed all of Schwab's business lines, inclusive of its firm's international entities. So, here to introduce his panel, Steve Paley.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. All right, so we have the privilege of being the last panel of the day and telling the future. So, no pressure here. But so we have the privilege of bringing today's proceedings together and attempt to look forward on where we were going with respect to international trade order and how the U.S. and Canada in particular will interact. Albeit some panels have addressed aspects of this today, but we'll get some more great perspectives here from our esteemed panel. So over the last 24 hours, we have heard a lot of history about how tariffs have been previously implemented, protectionism has reigned, and a rules-based trade order in North America and around the world has emerged and been the norm for several decades. This has served to significantly enhance the U.S. and Canadian relationship and partnership, as we've heard from so many panelists today and speakers yesterday. But now this hangs in the balance, and the circumstances seem to change on a daily basis, as we've talked about, with perhaps more reasons and context behind this and what negotiations are happening, as Dan mentioned in the last panel. With the imposition of country-specific tariffs and reciprocal retaliatory measures. We talk about a rules-based trade system. I mean, we've made reference to it throughout the day today, but might be good to have a little reminder of what that is before we get into some theory and future telling here. So WTO defines it as aims to ensure a fair, predictable, and transparent international trade through agreed upon rules and mechanisms, promoting economic growth and stability. So a rules-based trade system ensures that individuals, businesses, and governments know what the trade rules are around the world, and it gives them the confidence to do business under stable and predictable conditions. The Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2023 said, quote, multilateral trade rules provide critical consistency, helping support even the smallest firms to buy and sell across borders. So obviously we've talked about today in multiple panels and yesterday about how that order is certainly being challenged. So with all of that, we have an esteemed group of panelists that have the expertise to navigate us through these questions of short and long-term paradigm outlook in North America and more broadly, and what the future of Canada-U.S. relations might look like. And most importantly, to end the conference here, how do the U.S. and Canada continue to work together during this time? So I'm going to go around and introduce our panel here, and I'm going to start with, on the screen, I'll look behind me, we do have Gary there. So Gary Huffbauer is joining us virtually from New Mexico. He is a non-resident senior fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Before joining the Peterson Institute in 1985, he was a Marcus Wallenberg Professor of International Financial Diplomacy at Georgetown And from 1974 to 1980, Huffpower served as a tax and trade official in the U.S. Treasury Department. To my left, Juscelino Colares is a professor of business law and political science and co-director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center. Professor Colares practiced at Dewey Ballantine in Washington, where he litigated trade cases before federal agencies, federal courts, and NAFTA panels. And he was recently reappointed by the Office of the USTR to serve on the 2023-2024 U.S. roster of panelists for trade disputes under the USMCA, and has served on the roster of U.S. panelists for USMCA since 2018. And prior to that, served on the U.S. roster of North American Free Trade Agreement Chapter 19 panelists since 2013. And to his left is Nathan Rickard, partner at Pickard, Kenson Rowe. Nathan represents U.S. industries in matters related to trade remedy laws. He has prosecuted anti-dumping, countervailing, and safeguard duties petitions before the U.S. Department of Commerce and U.S. International Trade Commission. He has substantial experience in administrative review proceedings before the U.S. Court of International Trade and U.S. Court of Appeals. So I would be remiss, Chris Sands started the CUSLI karaoke tradition here, which I feel like should be an event in every, maybe with the 50th here, we should start that. So Headed for the Future is a song by Neil Diamond in 1986, and I feel like, okay, well, we're talking about the future here, so I got to give that. But then in the last panel, I saw the sun come out, so it might be a serendipitous time to think about Here Comes the Sun, and maybe it's more appropriate to end the conference. So let's see where we go. So with that, we'll start kind of with our first question. And Gary, if it's okay to start with you, but I'd be interested to have all the panelists weigh in on this. Very broad question to start with, but where do we see the international trade order going? Is this a short-term paradigm change? Is this a long-term paradigm change? What can we kind of expect in general going forward? So I'll pass it to Gary first, hopefully you can hear me.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You hear me okay?
Sound good.
Okay, great. Well, I enjoyed some of the earlier panels and the luncheon speaker. I noted that there was an attempt by some to be sympathetic with Trump or at least understand what he's coming at, trying to do. And my view is that it's unmitigated disaster. But even in unmitigated disaster and chaos, there are winners. So the winners from what's happened so far are pundits and journalists, pundits like Laura Dawson and myself and Chris Sands. We're busier than ever. Journalists are busier than ever. I get back-to-back interviews. Lawyers will surely benefit from this. This has to be a terrific boon to legal practice, because chaos creates litigation, and there will be a lot of litigation. But the third winner, which I really have to emphasize, is China. Peter Navarro is China's best friend. President Xi could not have imagined a better geopolitical scenario than what has been created. That leaves China, together with the EU, as leaders of the world trading system, and further, these neutral tariffs, 145% against China, China doing a good 125 against the U.S., will substantially reduce trade between our two countries, but it will hurt China far less than it will hurt the U.S. So with those winners in mind, I want to just toss in a little ad. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, we run a microsite on the USMCA, and we try to dig into the details, assuming that the USMCA will survive the current turmoil. I think it also has to be said that relative to other countries, Canada will do fairly well. That means it will suffer less. And Mexico will do fairly well, suffering less. I think Canada is actually in the best position. And a small symbol of that is here in New Mexico, which is far away from Canada. One of my neighbors flies the Canadian flag. So we have a lot of sympathy in this country for Canada, shown by the Senate resolution and popular polls. Turning very quickly to the legal side of things, this assault on the Constitution under the IEPA order of April 2nd already has generated cases. Now, I think the leading case by an outfit called the NACL, I think is misplaced in that it challenges the China tariffs, because China tariffs, as much as I deplore them, can be pretty easily defended on national security grounds. But the IEPA order with a 10% universal tariff, which is a clear intrusion of Article 1, Section 8 on congressional powers, and hopefully that will be litigated and in time reversed. That is, the 10% universal tariff will be reversed by the Supreme Court. As well, we're going to see what we've already seen in Section 232 cases on aluminum and steel, and we will see others, copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. But while it's very much an uphill battle to challenge a 232 case, I'm hoping that there will be some clients and law firms who will do that, because I think it's just a mammoth expansion of the notion of national security to limit steel imports, or for that matter, pharmaceutical import from Canada. I mean, come on. This is just a stretch. And so even a 232 case can be, if it's properly framed, can be challenged. Coming very briefly to the, to the rules-based architecture, I mean, the U.S. has completely violated the WTO, and it's completely violated its FTA with, Canada and Mexico and 20 other FTAs as well with these tariffs. So you wonder, well, what's the sense of the rules? Well, what Trump is introducing is a framework which is closer to Tammany Hall than anything in the last 50 years. And he's advertised it. If you're a company which needs a tariff break to do your investment, hey, come along and see. If you're a country that wants a tariff break to sell something, come along and see me. I mean, this is an invitation to corruption on a scale we have never seen in most of our lifetime, because most of it are less than 100 years old. So, the silver lining on that is that with all this kind of trade policy for sale, a lot of lawyers, you'd be remiss if you didn't do your lobbying and practice to take advantage.
Oh. That's why you go first, right? We can come back to Gary Giuslino. Do you want? Oh, wait, he's back. Gary, we lost you for a moment, but you're back.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, I don't know at what point you lost me. Maybe you want to go on to another panelist, or?
It was only for about 5 seconds. So if you want to wrap up.
Well, I just wrapped up and said that, with trade policy for sale, regardless of the rules in the WTO, FTA, any other rule, it's for sale by the Trump administration, by a company, or for sale to a company, for sale to a country, whatever. And as I said, this invites corruption on a scale we have not seen in our lifetimes, because you have to go back to the 1920s to find this kind of political environment. Harding, Teapot Dome down here in New Mexico. Most people, I guess, remember some of that. Well, but with all this trade policy for sale, you know, any lawyer, practicing lawyer, would be remiss if she or he did not represent her firm or his firm, his client, to the best of his ability to get a piece of that trade policy as needed by the firm. So, you know, that's the silver lining on what is a very catastrophic situation.
Thanks, Gary. Giuselino, I'm sure you have a perspective to share on this based on.
So I thought we had agreed on opening remarks and then answering questions, but should I? I'll just
Sure.
go to.
Go ahead.
Should
Opening
I
remarks is
answer?
good. Opening remarks is good, and yeah, we can.
Okay, I'll try to be quick, and then I can address some points later that Gary raised. So, in an attempt to sum up roughly the content and tenor of the discussions today, I guess most here would agree that the crisis in international trade is a result of President Trump's pursuit of a new path or architecture on trade for the United States. Given this is the path the president chose, I guess the most relevant question for us to ponder is which of the ideas proposed here are electorally feasible and which are doomed because they're likely to conflict with the motivations of the current domestic office holders. To answer this question, one has to take note of a few major constraints the president and his team face. First, because campaigning for midterms in the next comes in the next 18 months, time is a key constraint for the president. Undertaking this project with elastic timelines would doom his presidency. This is the reason most previous presidents, and Chuck Schumer, when he served as minority leader in the last few times, always made trade fairness a campaign issue, but invariably kicked the can down the road. Second, any answer to the question regarding the feasible path forward on trade requires clear thinking on the constraint that the $1 trillion annual interest payment on our $36 trillion national debt imposes. This debt must be refinanced in the combination of rising budget deficits over the years and would cause bond yields to rise and cripple the U.S. economy. This is why President Trump chose to go full bore on DOGE as soon as he was sworn in to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and began lobbying for the one so-called beautiful deficit-reducing bill Congress must pass and is about to pass. A rescission package is hopefully coming as well. Rescission is when previously authorized expenditures or appropriated money, the president basically comes back to the Congress and says, look, I don't want to spend this. So, to put it bluntly, President Trump will not allow the government of the United States to enter into a debt financing meltdown. Third, foreigners owe about $8.7 trillion of our $36 trillion deficit, basically treasuries, which amounts to close to a quarter of the public debt. This means that for the benefit of running $920 billion trade deficit in 2024, we had to pay foreigners just short of $250 billion in interest payments last year. The math here is clear. Worse, China, our biggest geopolitical interest, will have us in an economic chokehold not too far in the future if current government spending and trade deficits remain unchecked. So time, politically thinking in terms of politics, time, bond yields, and national security are President Trump's three main constraints. He sees former U.S. presidents have been complacent, which is a solution to their political business cycle issue, and of course, awfully predictable on trade. And he knows that our allies know this. Presidents have chosen the path of least resistance, therefore, right? You don't have to fight your bureaucracy, and you don't have to fight your allies, so kick the can down the road. That's what generally politicians do. Angela Merkel, Barack Obama, and Justin Trudeau, the first two lauded by The Economist, not less than a decade ago, as the leaders of the West in previous years left their economies poorly positioned for the challenges ahead. Trudeau basically copied Merkel in resigning without leaving, also made his country a lot worse than he received it. The audience may ask you, okay, fine, United States, you have a China problem. What is it with us, the EU, Japan, we're Canada? We are your allies. Well, unlike the Soviet Union, our erstwhile geopolitical rival, with which we traded basically nothing and most of our allies didn't trade with, we trade with China. So we have to act together. Yet, given our low level of tariffication under the WTO architecture, there's very little we can do to get you to lower your barriers with us and act together in concert with China. Believe me, we tried. We tried steel, overcapacity, aluminum. Nothing happens because everything that goes to the OECD goes there to die. So we have very little to give away in terms of tariff concessions because our tariffs are already so low. So President Trump knows this, and he sees the path to a trade solution lies on general tariff and non-tariff barrier reset. That's what we have to do. We have to reset. Over the post-war period, Congress has given U.S. presidents a lot of discretion by delegating to them authority to negotiate trade deals and determine tariffs. He could not get all our allies, neighbors, and other countries to the table by any other means. That's known. So the dynamic began with fentanyl and immigration / shutting down the border tariffs. Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau first, we'll call him the idea is stupid, insulting the president, and Ontario Premier Ford promised to retaliate and got further retaliatory tariffs and then reprieves. Second came reciprocal tariffs. Secretary Bessent, right? Bessent? Bessent. Clearly communicated that the way to a deal was non-retaliation. He clearly said this, right? The Europeans threatened but then stayed their hand. The Chinese Maoists characteristically doubled down. I mean, I went to college in Brazil with them, so I know exactly what they were going to do. So that's what we all expected them to do. And the moment to de-escalate with our allies arrived when, one, bond markets went crazy, which is bad because we need to refinance the debt in the short term with rising interest rates. We have a big debt spiral problem, so it's time to take it down a notch, right? But mission accomplished. We've managed to isolate China, right? And President Trump is, again, he's a rational player. And rational players don't need to look like they're acting rationally all the time, okay? So he knows the limits of his leverage, right? Sorry if this offends, some people here in the audience, but he knows what his leverage points are. And leverage is something you determine ex ante, right? And then you negotiate with knowing that leverage, and whatever out of there at the end is basically the outcome based on whatever leverage you perceive or you actually have. So I'd like to end with a historical note. The so-called rules-based trade system was founded in 1947. This rule-based system created GATT, the IMF, and among other institutions. It was created as a Western sandbox, despite the enormous amount of communists infiltrated into the State Department, right, who basically wanted to give everything to Stalin and to the Soviet Union, as they did. Like we gave them military assistance without asking for anything, any conditionality. Despite that, we basically made sure that the idea was we would not keep, perpetual trade surplus by one country or one set of countries against one country or another set of countries. That idea was completely rejected. John Maynard Keynes, who represented Great Britain in Bretton Woods, clearly even articulated the creation of an international clearing union, which was basically was going to work with a kind of a tax that would basically a portion of your surplus would be under a major international, governmental financial institution, and if you kept your trade surpluses for a long time, you'd get a tax on it. You would get less of your trade, or of whatever you deposit a percentage of your trade surplus to disincentivize countries to maintain trade suppressors for the long run, because he saw that this was not politically feasible. So we've had 70 years to adjust. We didn't. The international settlement system was never created. The current constraints on the U.S. government and the willingness of President Trump to take U.S. interests seriously and not behave like a typical politician mean that now is the time to settle in a new trade framework. Secretaries Bessent and Bessent and Lutnick are obviously taking calls. To the point about, we've been here before, right? Litigation. The president has, the Supreme Court has numerous times approved in his first term the non-delegation doctrine, right? The doctrine basically says that there's only one major limit to president's use of his authority delegated by Congress, and that is that he cannot act as a legislator, right? That's basically the line, and that line gives the president enormous discretion. The IEPA, well, there's a separation of powers issue. The president has, Article 2 powers. Of course, those powers are more restricted when he's acting under Article 1 power, such as the IEPA. But the problem is that other than some district court judges in the country right now, and I don't suppose that would be the case, you would have at least a 3-judge panel at the United States Court of International Trade. I don't think people are very excited, given recent Supreme Court precedent, in challenging the president's authority or second-guessing the president's authority under Article 2 of Foreign Relations Power, or even under EPA. And regardless, the negotiations will or should be done expeditiously. So the president is not going to allow time in our allies or our trade frenemies to basically determine the line. So negotiating a new architecture, this is where we are. The new architecture is a new sandbox, right? And the sandbox, I can go into more detail about that later. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. And Nathan, we'll go over to you, and then we'll do some follow-ups based on his comments so far.
Thank you, Stephen. I am a little embarrassed sitting up here because I have enjoyed listening to all of the panels before today with people who know a lot. I know a little about a particular subject. I do anti-dumping and countervailing duty law. I represent U.S. industries. I've done so for 25 years. I am also the chair of the Committee to Support U.S. Trade Laws, which is the American organization that that is composed of U.S. businesses, industries, and labor unions that use the trade remedy laws. I guess the unique thing that I can bring to the conversations that people have had is I have to be focused on my clients and whether or not they're actually achieving the goals that that they are setting out to do, which means rhetoric doesn't matter. Ideology doesn't matter. What matters is their business improving? Are they able to operate? So you've heard that lawyers will benefit from these actions taken by this administration. That's probably not true. We have 734 anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders currently in place in the United States. 734. 236 of those involve China, right? So that's, how does that work out to be? That's a third of the overall anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. With our friends in Canada, the total number is 7. We have 7 anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. There's a whole lot of litigation and a whole lot of lawyers getting paid for those anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. And the entire corpus of the anti-dumping and countervailing duties, in the last year that Customs and Border Protection reported those figures, the imported value covered by those trade remedies was $37 billion. Right, so our total trade is, our total imports, $3.3 trillion. Our total amount subject to AD/CVD, $37 billion. The amount deposited at the border, around $3.6 billion. So we got a whole lot of legal mechanisms for what is effectively a 10% duty on unfairly traded goods. And we have a president who just announced a 10% duty on everything because he announced it. That's not good for attorneys. I mean, that means a completely different process. It might be good for Dan, for people who are more used to having conversations with people and getting policy outcomes, but it is not something that is beneficial to trade lawyers. There's also been a comment about, lots of comments today about what we really are talking about when we talk about America's trade concerns is China, and everything starts and ends with China. The thought that China would be the biggest winner, or that China will develop into a leader in the space of free trade, is so far from what the experienced reality is for participants in the trade that I do not understand where it comes from. And then we'll give you just an example of how, when we are representing U.S. industries, we think about trade with China very differently than trade with anybody else. The administration has talked about setting up an external revenue service and collecting duties for which they would have revenue that would go into the U.S. Treasury. And then that could be used to fund tax cuts or other types of fiscal policy. The problem that comes up is that in our anti-dumping and countervailing duty experience, the worst duty collection experience that the United States has is on goods from China. That even in the legal system of the way that it is structured, our ability to collect duties on goods that have entered into the United States after entry is around 26%. So we collect 25 cents of every dollar that's collected. And the $4 billion that's owed to U.S. Treasury, 85% of that is accounted by Chinese origin goods. I think people have also heard mentioned today that you know that China is going to evade tariffs, it's going to go through other places, and that the administration is on top of that. Good luck to them. The experience for the last 20 years is that the effort to evade payments on any duties or any trade regulations is beyond what our capacity is to govern at the border, or to regulate at the border. We currently have, because of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, there's an administrative procedure before U.S. Customs and Border Protection called the Enforce and Protect Act. We call it EPA. If you go to Customs and Border Protection's website where they report on how EPA has been working, this is with illegal circumvention and evasion of trade remedies, anti-dumping and CBD orders. There are a total of 304 cases that the agency is investigating. And 261 of those 304 cases involve products from China. Again, everything that we talk about when we talk about a rules-based trading system has been under strain for 20 years by a trade participant, a trade partner, that does not abide by rules. And that is the reality that I think that we are talking about when we think about what is the future of a rules-based trading system. It has to reflect the reality of who actually wants to abide by rules and who is going to bind themselves along with their trading partners so that we have something where you know what the rules of the road are and that you have expectations that you can have, that you can make investments in going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So, I mean, all three of you have talked about kind of different background-related things that are in the current state. So, you talked about evading payments and deficit and debt issues and constitutional challenges. So, if you can kind of put on your future hat, what does that all mean for the long-term paradigm? Because these are all kind of current challenges that could change going forward, or could have different outcomes going forward. What does that mean for the rules-based trade paradigm in the long term? Or is it too early to tell? So I'll maybe go back to Gary to start.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me, Stephen? Do you hear me?
You're good now.
No, you're not hearing me.
We can hear you.
Hello? Hello? Is that working?
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. I appreciate that Nathaniel and I are at opposite poles of this question, and he gave you a lot of statistics on trade remedies, duties, and so forth. What Trump has done in one day exceeds what the trade remedy issues are in terms of violation of rules by an order of, at least a factor of 10 and probably a factor of 100. I mean, you're imposing, he's threatened a 31% tariff on Switzerland. My goodness gracious. I've done a lot of work in Switzerland. It's as close to free trade as Singapore. And 31%, that's kind of out of the blue. That's because they exported so much bullion to the U.S. that he came up with this bizarre calculation. But where are we going from here? Which is your question, Stephen. The test will be the USMCA. As someone said in the last panel, the negotiation has already started. I mentioned the Institute's website. There are a lot of genuine issues that were in the USMCA prior to the Trump tariff assault. So we had issues on dairy, issues on energy, issues on digital, issues on lumber, and on, all genuine issues, which could be negotiated. So the real question is whether the Trump administration will go forward with Canada and Mexico and forge a new pact, and then will live with it during the term in office, as opposed to coming in and negotiating one day and then coming in with a Section 232 national security tariff the next day. At the present time, there's very little trust in whatever President Trump may sign, because he changes his mind quite quickly, and he enjoys the chaos and the attention that he gets from changing his mind. So that remains to be seen, but that is the big test. Right now, the WTO is in the freezer. In fact, the U.S. has suspended payments of the WTO dues. So it's hard to imagine anything going forward in the WTO anytime soon. But we have these other 20 free trade agreements, and the question is, where are they going to go? And then AGOA, which I know this is far away from Mexico, Canada, but the African Growth and Opportunity Act is for the moment dead, and it's really a lifesaver for a lot of small African countries in terms of their exports. So will that be revived? That's another, I wouldn't say that's a pressing question for Washington today, but it is a pressing question for Africa. So those are the kind of issues which will decide whether we kind of reestablish piece by piece, bit by bit, a rules-based system, or whether we just go, the powerful countries, that would be the U.S., Japan, China, Europe, will just, do it their own way, and let smaller countries just adjust their policies accordingly.
Thanks. Giuliano, Nathan?
I would basically say that litigation is no substitute to negotiation, and negotiation based on not necessarily perceived but objective leverage or objective capabilities in the interests of each country. I do think that there is a concern not only with tariffs but non-tariff barriers, as we, for example, EU Commissioner von der Leyen basically said, we're ready to go zero tariffs. And we are very interested in that deal, but at the same time, we know that it's the non-tariff barriers that get us. So, so that's going to take some time to get that sorted out. The negotiations with the Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, countries that really we want to have closer on our say security blanket or Indo-Pacific strategy. They need to deal with the issue of transshipment, which is the way China has evaded, has attempted to circumvent our trade disciplines. And so it's not only tariffs. It's tariff plus a bunch of other things, non-tariff barriers, the issue of transshipment with China. With the USMCA, the issue is simpler because of the content rules and because of Article 3210 of the USMCA, which basically says that you basically can't sign a free trade agreement with with a country deemed a non-free trade country, that was drafted with the express purpose of China. So in that sense, USMCA is simpler. But with respect to, I think from looking at this from a Canadian perspective, there are amazing things that Canada and the United States can do together on security, on energy, and energy is one of the major pillars of the Trump administration. I would say that definitely it would really, in a negotiation like this, it would really benefit Canada a lot if Canada had treated Alberta better and basically developed the permits and the pipelines or the simplification in terminals for the oil from the oil sands to be exported out of both the coasts or whichever coast is more feasible. And Canada hasn't done that. And 10 years wasted. And of course, all it took was a pen from Joe Biden and Warren Buffett, with the hand of Warren Buffett on top of it, because he's the major CSX.
The auto pen?
In that case, he might as well have been the auto pen because he's Joe Biden's #1 campaign contributor, right? And the biggest shareholder in CSX, which transports the oil sands into the U.S. and the main company that would lose from the Keystone Pipeline to be. And all it took was one day, and Joe Biden took that away. And I think Canada is more than right to sue the United States and come after it. But Canada needs to adopt this posture that it's going to search for its leverage and not just and look at the opportunities it can do to the United States. Of course, I would never suggest that Canada sign a customs union agreement with the United States because, I mean, I wouldn't be speaking seriously about making a deal with the United States. But the closer union, the closer you can get attached to the U.S. economy while also opening your opportunities with other countries, the better for Canada. And of course, we know that 95% of the Canadian population lives within 60 miles or 90 miles of the U.S. border. That's a huge component of U.S. leverage over Canada. We know the United States has vast energy resources, which it didn't when CUSLI was negotiated in the 80s. Those days are over. So the questions of capabilities and interests of countries change over time. Yes, we are friends. Yes, we are neighbors. Yes, we need to be friends, but we have interests too, and we have capabilities, and we have to be cognizant of these things and not just determine them and not just basically abstract away from them and expect that leverage is going to come out of a negotiation. Leverage is ex ante. So I think there's a lot that can be good that can be done, but it's going to be a bumpy ride until then. Thank you.
Professor Kolarz and Professor Huffbauer have very broad axes to grind. I am very narrow. Again, the big change in my practice in the 25 years that I have been an international trade attorney is that at this point, as a bipartisan agreement, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, in the United States, access to the United States market is considered a foreign policy tool. It is a way in which to achieve objectives overseas. We have seen, as some of you all know, that the U.S. is serious about enforcing its prohibition on goods produced through forced or child labor. And it has started to actually put a law that had been on the books since the 1920s, actually put that to the test. Now, there's also environmental issues that the U.S. has started to condition its market access to. One of the things that we work on at my firm is the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States. People generally know it. Been in place since 1972. It has had import provisions that entire time. 2025, those import provisions have never been actually enforced. They will be enforced for the first time in January 2026. When we talk about a rules-based trading order, what the United States, from my perspective, will be looking for is allies that have those same values, that are going to try and shape the way that global international production happens and what trade goes on between that. And that, I think, is kind of what the opportunity for Canada and the United States is, the shared values that allow for a consistent response to the challenges that we face. I mean, I was just watching a hearing yesterday where one of the Republican senators and Democratic senators were talking about their push for carbon taxes at the border. That is, it's an odd approach to hear those two sides go, but that is what I think we're moving towards.
Yeah, and so that dovetails well into maybe bringing it back a little bit to North America. So you talked about shared values. Is there enough shared values to create something within North America going forward, or does it make sense to, in particular, have the U.S. and Canada look towards outside of North America? We've talked a lot about today about Canada and the EU and other possible arrangements. So interested in what you all think about what North America looks like going forward, whether it's USMCA, CUSMA, or some kind of other arrangement that brings North America together, or again, finding shared values, if you will, outside of the continent. Someone wants to. Gary, you want to? We have a good order here, but we can keep that order if you'd like.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
You're good.
Okay, good. Say, listen, U.S. shared values with Canada are more shared than any other single country. I mean, I've traveled a lot in Canada, as everybody in this room has. I've dealt with Canadian officials. Members of my family have lived in Canada. I mean, my goodness, you can't ask for closer sharing. And as one of the Canadian speakers said, Canada's been with us in all our wars. Canada and Australia are very faithful allies in all our wars, even our unpopular wars. So, it's just amazing. This whole business about Trump and Canada is because Trump had a personal dislike for Trudeau. And that drove this ridiculous policy on fentanyl. I mean, yes, a pound of fentanyl can kill a lot of people, but, unlike guns are hard to make. That's pretty high tech. Fentanyl is very easy to make, and the money in fentanyl is just terrific. So, the 1 or 2 or 3 pounds or whatever that come across the border from Canada, that will be replaced by some outfit in northern New Mexico. If you've ever seen the TV series Breaking Bad, you know what I'm talking about. So, there's just a lot of ridiculous things happening. Now, turning to Mexico, which I live quite close to and have done a lot of work in Mexico and so forth. Well, the Hispanic population in the U.S. is pretty significant. And while they don't agree with a lot of things that Mexico does, they don't want some kind of, antagonism with Mexico, which cuts off trade and relations. And here in New Mexico, we have very close trade relations. We have, there's a border facility in Santa Teresa. If you cut that off, that's going to harm a lot of jobs here in New Mexico. There's a lot of sympathy with Mexico amongst Americans, and probably more amongst Hispanic or states like Texas and Arizona, which are close to Mexico. But the shared values are certainly there. It comes down to individual issues. Yes, the cartels are one of them, and they can be dealt with on an individual issue basis. CIA and DEA are very good operators in dealing with cartels if they have cooperation from Mexico. There are other issues as well, labor issues, and there's a very good provision in USMCA to deal with those and so forth. So there are a lot of individual issues which can be dealt with, but any big separation because we have value differences, I mean, that's just nonsense.
Okay, I would just say three deeply interrelated issues that for amazing cooperation between the United States and Canada: AI, energy, national security, right there. The United States is positioning its economy. It not only already has more than a 20% cost advantage over producing in Europe because of energy, because of access to energy, and ever freer access to energy. And Germany, got the memo. They're now building coal power plants, which is weird in light of their former priorities. But you need a lot of energy for AI. AI, it's where it's at, right? That's why we need to control our borders. Speaking as an immigrant myself, we need to control our borders. And borders exist for a reason. We respect Canada. Canada is a country for a reason. They have different choices. I'm a big supporter of the Second Amendment. That's not the case in Canada. You have a different view, and we have to respect and agree to disagree. That's wonderful. But national security, immigration, drugs, the concern with Mexico being a narco state. The government of Mexico controls just about 70, the drug cartels control 78% of the Mexican territory. The Mexican government really controls the federal district in Mexico City and areas nearby and other, sprinkling of areas. Otherwise, everything is the cartels that run it. That's a major concern. That's a major national security. I would say it's other than China, it's the #1 national security interest of the United States is the border. They have Javelin missiles. They got there from the Ukraine. I don't understand why we don't have more than just one brigade, but 6 brigades, Air Force brigades, right by the border, because our border is very, very porous, so we need to do a better job. So we need Canada, also to coordinate with us there. So there are a number of areas where Canada stands to benefit greatly in terms of its enviable merit-based immigration system that can learn a lot of that from Canada, which is something that President Trump defends. But AI, energy, and national security are areas right there, and that Canada can seize it. The European Union is trying to regulate AI as much as it can. It's trying to kill it, as it did with social media and other major innovations in the past 30 years. They're over. They've given up. That's not where dynamism is at. Canada and the United States have that. We coordinate a lot. And so as Canada embarks and hopefully at some point gives up its carbon tariff, which is a disastrous economic decision in every possible way, and unleashes Alberta and unleashes other regions of Canada, there's a lot we can do in terms of AI and cross-border trade and data transfers, and that's something that would help the United States a lot. It would help Canada a lot. Thank you.
Nathan.
I think there are all kinds of examples of places where Canada and the United States can exercise and show shared values that place those countries together and start to build a bloc. China perceived that it had an internal security threat from members of its population, and it created an carceral state that also included a labor program. That has been a challenge for global trade, and the United States has responded with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. FOLPA. A question is, how committed is Canada and the U.S.'s allies and trading partners to ensure that there is a consistent response to that? One concern is when you see products that are knocked out of the U.S. market going into Canada, and what is this, like the level of seriousness of which we can take those shared values and take action going forward. I think there are many examples like that where there are things that I think are essential to how we perceive ourselves both as Americans and as Canadians, that there is lots of opportunities to work together, and I'm hoping that becomes more of a focal point as this administration moves forward. But I don't know.
Makes sense. All right, well, just being mindful of the time, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. And okay, go ahead. And do you mind going up to the microphone, just so people online can hear you?
Well, Professor Colares, do you think that given political statements that tariff revenue and duty revenue could make a large payment into Social Security or against the national debt, are those somewhat exaggerated? How would that really work?
I do believe that on the question of tariffs, of course, tariffs are indirect taxes. That's the standard definition you can find in U.S. tax law. Like tariffs are an indirect tax. In the last round of negotiating with China, a lot of that tariff was eaten up by Chinese producers, right? So, given the levels where the tariffs are right now, they're not going to eat that up. Trade is just basically going to the decoupling is going to be more pronounced. So, if there's more decoupling, if there's less tariff due Spain because there's less trade, although the rate is very high, there's less volume. So I wouldn't necessarily hinge a lot of my hopes on tariffs being, or the External Revenue Service, right, being the major purveyor of funds for the Treasury. But there is some truth to that you can finance. Until 1913, when the IRS, we had the income revenue tax created, we did not have it. We funded our government. Granted, the economies were not as integrated then as they are now, but again, but it can be let me just say, it can be a piece of the puzzle. But nothing can help the United States government more than cutting spending drastically. Look at Argentina, right? Where Argentina was a year and a half ago and where Argentina is right now. So cutting spending, we have a spending problem, so that we can then cut taxes further, and then reviewing our entitlements, and then the fact that demographically we're a different country than we were when Social Security was created, so we need to look into that. But that's for later. But for now, I would say, yes, it's a piece, but it's not the major component.
You didn't ask me, but I walk around with these numbers, so I'm going to throw them out. So fiscal year 2016, the total amount of duties and taxes that we collected in the United States was $40 billion. Fiscal year 2022, several years into the China Section 301 tariffs, total taxes that total duties collected is $112 billion. That went down in 2023 to $92 billion. So you got a couple things going on. One, the scope, the amount that we're talking about, and very high. Mm-hmm. Second, as Giuslino's talked about, that amount is going to vary depending on where trade is overall. The third thing that's interesting, that people talk about the history of like the revenue service and where this came from, but there's some things that have happened in between time. Like, we don't take customs duties seriously in the United States. We take them so unseriously that we have a law that 30% of all duties collected on any imported goods goes to USDA school lunch programs and USDA commodity purchases. 30% of the duties that are collected on fishery products is the only other thing besides the USDA fund NOAA fisheries. Some of those guys are like, well, wait a second. I mean, if you start looking at these budgets about how much duties we're collecting, until that all gets fixed and worked out, we're not set up to think about the customs duties as a serious piece of revenue generation for the U.S. government and for its expenditures. That may happen.
De minimis.
That may happen, but it is not where we currently are, and there's a lot more work that would need to be done.
So the United States has moved very, very far away from 1789 when
Absolutely.
our government was funded with whiskey taxes and the harbor tax and a few other small forms of revenue.
Yeah, I mean, our total tariff rate right now is 2.8% on the amount of imports that we bring in. So, I mean, this stuff will go up, we'll see what happens. It's a totally different paradigm. But we don't, it's not having experience, and it's also not having the infrastructure for what you're going to do with it to talk about the numbers that people are throwing out right now.
One thing I would add is the de minimis issue. The goods of small value don't pay, coming from China, for example, pay no tax. I mean, so we've basically almost like asked the Chinese to basically develop entire industries around producing, ratchet straps. I'm going to take my motorcycle to the mechanic in 2 weeks, so I need to put my bike on the back of my truck. I need ratchet straps. All of those are made in China, right? Except there's one made in New Zealand. I just found out one. But, and these things come at a very low value, and only now the United States is considering, oh, we're going to look into that too. Most of what you do, the value-added tax, the VAT, the issue with Europe, right? German cars leave Europe, and then the VAT that was otherwise due, they take it off because they say VAT goes by the rule of consumption. Place of consumption is the United States. There's no reason for the VAT. Well, what happens is when the US car, the Cadillac, goes to Germany, it's going to be consumed in Germany, therefore, the VAT. So it's not, again, it's not only the tariff, right? It's the non-tariff barriers. The VAT issue with Europe is ginormous, gigantic, right? So we need to look into these things, and now is the time.
Similar to the Japanese having 128 types of snow so that they can't take our American skis and import them because they don't match their types of snow, right? Things like that, non-tariff barriers.
168 types of salt.
I didn't know that.
Yes, amazing.
Can I add a little arithmetic to this discussion, Steve?
Isn't the VAT equivalent to a state sales tax?
Yep. Hi, Steve, you hearing me?
Isn't the VAT equivalent to a state sales tax here? So, in the UK, for example, value-added tax is a UK sales tax, essentially, right? Tax on sales. So, I agree with what you're saying, but it's just another way of saying virtually the same thing, right?
Right, but
Sales tax isn't refunded when you leave the US.
the sales tax are not refunded. That's the thing. The sales tax is not refunded. You get the tax that otherwise would be due back. So basically, it's an industrial policy.
It's a setup.
Well, yeah, okay.
It's a setup between
Yeah.
what you're collecting and what you're paying.
Yeah. And I can give you examples. I mean, I come from Brazil, right? Most of the industry in Brazil, over 50% of Brazilian GDP in São Paulo. It's São Paulo state. I come from the northeast of Brazil, the place with beautiful beaches and, until recently, not much industry, right? Well, the people from São Paulo like to say, look, we are the engine of Brazil. You're basically sucking from us all the time. I mean, it's the same thing the people from Barcelona say to the rest of Spain. Well, there was a policy for that. Franco basically concentrated industry in the area of Barcelona, right? For numerous reasons, strategic including, because they didn't want them to separate and everything. So these regions basically feel entitled because you concentrate it. Well, the Germans, what the Germans are doing with cars and other products, and the Europeans in general with the VAT, is basically saying, look, we're going to create a VAT for anything that comes, although it was never produced here. Oh, it's a sales tax, yes, but if it's a sales tax, how come it gets refunded when it's going out?
Right.
It's a sale.
So refund it in the U.S.
I'm sorry?
Refund your state tax in the U.S. You created the problem yourself.
Oh, we can, that's an excellent conversation. That's an excellent point. We can negotiate that, but let's talk about it. Yeah. No. We have to negotiate one-on-one. We need to understand on what basis are you trading with us. This is what we ignored for years, and that can no longer go like this. And politically, it's impossible. Right now, the Democrats may be saying all they're saying in Congress, but they know They're fighting, an 80-20% issue, and they're going to keep fighting 80 to 20% issues all they want, right? Because that's what Trump is forcing them to do all the time with Doge. I mean, you're going to defend waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, fine. Be my guest. You're going to defend a number of other issues that are 80 to 20. The issues of trade from the perception of the American middle class, right? Where it's more and more inaccessible for young people in their 20s, and that's why they're delaying marriage and everything else, to buy a house because the price of real estate, right, which is a non-tradable, right, keeps increasing. Why? Because part of the problem with the trade deficit, part of the problem is that for the current account to adjust, that foreign money comes into the country. So you see foreigners buying 8% of real estate last year, right? So which bids up prices. So there are all kinds of things that we need to talk about, the indirect effects of trade. And I'll basically conclude by just saying one thing. The goal of a government is not to maximize consumer value. It never was. It never was. If that was the goal, David Ricardo, when he wrote Principles of Political Economy and created the principle, right, of comparative advantage, he would have never compared Britain with Portugal, trading cloth with wine. He would have compared Britain with the biggest rival of Britain at the time, France. Note that he never did that, right? Those countries, when it came to comparative advantage, they could care less about comparative advantage. So again, just a reminder that even to David Ricardo, a member of the parliament, right? The theory of comparative advantage was not, complete dogma. The examples he gives are not examples of, clear comparative advantage. There was comparative advantage by the French in certain, in agriculture alone, and in certain manufacturers as well. But he never talked about that. He talked about trade between England and Portugal. Because why? Because there are geopolitical interests. And people that basically rely on economic models, they rely on a theory that is not based on power relations. And this is what the current administration perceives. The future of the United States is not feasible in the current system. We need a new one, and it's going to have to change. Thank you.
And Gary, I think you were trying to say something as well, so I want to make sure you can jump in.
Well, so many things have been said, and so time is so limited. Let me just make a couple of points. First, the durable part of the tariff package that Trump has announced is the 10% universal tariff. That would raise at most about $400 billion a year. The U.S. fiscal deficit is about $2 trillion a year. And the renewal of the tax, the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act will, enlarge the deficit in all likelihood. So the tariff revenue is not an answer to solving the U.S. deficit problem, though it does make a contribution. I mean, $400 billion, if that's what the number turns out to be per year, is a substantial amount of money, but the U.S. deficit problems are even, much larger. So that would be my comment there. And I want to emphasize that the value-added tax, which was mentioned by a previous speaker, this was decided by the Supreme Court way back when I was in the Treasury Department, in line with what the Treasury said. This is not a non-tariff barrier. This is ridiculous to call it a non-tariff barrier. That would be like calling the sales tax in New Mexico as a non-tariff barrier on imports from other countries. No, it's not. It's a tax on consumption that everyone pays, every producer pays, whether local or foreign. So the characterization of that as a non-tariff barrier is just another piece of disinformation by the Trump administration. However, when they came down to calculating tariff barriers, they never tried to estimate, tariff, non-tariff barrier country by country. They just used this simple and quite idiotic arithmetic of taking the U.S. deficit with a country dividing it by U.S. imports from that country and saying that that's the measure of unfairness, which is a very simplistic notion. As the Nobel economist Robert Solow once said, I have a consistent deficit with my barter. And when you think about that, well, that's about what's happening here with these tariff barriers. So there's a lot to talk about. I've enjoyed the session. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you. I think we have one more question.
Still got a couple minutes
Yeah.
here, so.
Go ahead, Steve.
All right, I want to ask a question, and I hope you guys get very technical in answering this, but what's the status of the World Trade Organization, and what's the future use of the World Trade Organization?
Yeah, I think as a trade law practitioner, the World Trade Organization is dead. I mean, and I think that there's going to be different views on it overall, but it does not inform the way that we think about making recommendations for policy and actions of anything going before the WTO. So you've got an administration that has now decided that it's no longer even going to be funding the organization. I don't have any predictions as to what happens in its stead, but I do know that in terms of just how I practice, I no longer hear back from federal agencies or government officials, does this violate the WTO? That's just not the world that we live in anymore.
I would say I completely agree. It's basically dead. It's a zombie. It's alive, but it's dead. Right? That's the classical definition of a zombie. And the veto is back, right? Since the appellate body doesn't work, is not in operation since 2019. Is it 2019 or December 2018, I think. So the country that loses basically requests at the panel level for an appeal, and so the decision is blocked immediately, effectively. So the veto is back. What we had during GATT is back again. Why? Because there's a reason for things. In the same way, the United States Security Council has 5 members, right? And why doesn't it change? And I mean, I've heard several scholars saying, oh, it should change to reflect certain different realities, the global south, etc. No. I mean, it's basically a reflection of where a power compromise was reached. People tend to think that we don't live in a world where there are sovereign states. You know, there are sovereign states, and they are the ultimate bosses of what goes on. And the WTO basically legislated itself through its decisions into irrelevance by the appellate body and panels. And it is where it is, deservedly so. And by the way, who's the leader? Somebody who never practiced trade law. Director General, Ngozi, never practiced trade law, is there. I mean, why is that person serving? At least when the Deputy General Director, our former boss, Alan Wolf, was there, you had somebody who knew, his counterpart in the United States, Bob Lighthizer. They shared a client once, the steel client, right? Skadden and Dewey Ballantyne. So they were wise to put somebody, very experimented with trade. And by the way, that's how you knew Trump meant business the first time he picked, Bob Lighthizer, who knows how to litigate trade cases. And I knew immediately that Trump was there for business. So now we have Greer, who's a very seasoned guy, and Besant, right? Amazing guy, and understands the markets very well. So Article 21, another reason, right? The national security. The United States has always taken the position that's self-enforcing, that it is not for the WTO to determine when the United States can invoke its national security. That is a joke to think that people in Geneva will get to second-guess the United States President, the Department of Defense, on what is in the interest of the United States or the Department of Commerce. I mean, it's a gigantic joke. and the destruction and the complete evisceration of the standard of reviews under the WTO agreements that the appellate body and the panels, dispute settlement body, did over the years until 2001 and 2001, and this is nothing to do with the entry into China, but until 2001 the appellate body was functioning fairly well. And then it's not because of China. It's because there's a phenomenon called the judicialization of trade. Trade is diplomacy, first and foremost. When you talk about a rules-based system, you cannot forget that trade is all about diplomacy, and that you can judicialize it as much as you want until it breaks. And then it goes back to being all about diplomacy. The GATT system, in its great wisdom, the great wisdom of that generation of the late 40s, was created with a veto system, recognizing that there are certain moments when countries basically say, look, I cannot comply with these particular rules because this is the end of a particular industry for me, or the end of any political support any government with half an ounce of intelligence in my country can have. So there were certain areas that were out of it. Now we integrated more areas in, and then we did away with the veto. Where is the system back at? Where it was. That was the equilibrium position. They tried to, but they never succeeded in massing with the United Nations Security Council. Well, they succeeded in massing with the GATT system and with the WTO, and look at where we are. We're back at GATT, but worse. So it's going to take some effort to basically get back to a GATT, and that's why I keep insisting on the idea of a sandbox, right? GATT was based on a sandbox theory, that the West was basically going to trade together, right? Trade together and isolate, the Soviet Union. China was not relevant at the time, right? And that's what we did. So we may be getting back to those days. Let's have the sandbox, right? Let's create the sandbox with clear rules, without quasi-judicial overreach by panelists, right? Respecting the rights of sovereigns, recognizing your limitation, recognize that this is a diplomacy-based system, right? And then we can do better. But again, dealing with China without a sandbox or the threat of tariffs against everybody, which is where we are right now, is impossible.
I want to know.
That's where we are there right now.
I want to know who owns the sandbox and who's going to play in it with the U.S.
Want to take that, Gary?
Well, I agree with much that was said, but my 2 cents are: one, the U.S. has essentially withdrawn from the WTO. Even if it starts paying its dues, it's not participating. However, the declaration of the announcement of the death of the WTO is premature, because there are a lot of other countries that belong, and it's very likely the sandbox will be dominated by Europe and China. And many other countries will belong to the sandbox and do business within it. But the notion of grand agreements without the U.S. participation is probably a legacy of the past. However, there will be individual agreements on all kinds of issues that come up. We've seen the fisheries being discussed. There may be some agreement on, carbon border taxes, agreements on digital taxation, what's permissible, what isn't, and so on. So, and these agreements, they won't be signed by 164 countries, but they may be signed by 60 or 80 countries. Meanwhile, there are big plurilateral or regional agreements which are very much alive. The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which both Canada and Mexico are members of. The U.S. is not. Trump took us out in his first term, but that's going very well. Possibly South Korea will join. China would like to join. And then there's the Chinese regional agreement Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership, RCEP, which is alive and well. Mercosur and the EU just signed an agreement, and some substance may come out of that. So there's a lot being done on the regional level outside the WTO. But the U.S. is, as has been said, is not now a participant, and it may be quite a while before the U.S. comes back to the party.
All right, well, go ahead.
To the question, I just would say, again, I know the least of everybody who spoke, but I think that like the litmus test is China, and really how are you going to deal with China overall? If the perception is that as a country or as a sovereign, you believe that China should have a leadership position in international trade, probably not part of the American sandbox. That's the extent of my understanding of it.
All right, well, looking at the time, just wanted to thank everyone. Thank you three for a great discussion. Might be playing in different sandboxes, to use the analogy, but appreciate the different perspectives. And in all of that, we also came together on areas where, no matter what the situation is, where the U.S. and Canada can continue to work together in various areas. So we'll leave on that high note, and to use one last song reference with Sand, Enter Sandman. You know, we're getting to the end of the conference here, and we'll conclude on that. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you very much, Steve, and your panel. That was an awesome discussion. I'm glad you got technical at the end. Thank you for that, too. So, the goal here of this conference, was to look at this kind of tense time in Canada-U.S. relations and be open and honest and intellectually honest and thorough and reasonable and respectful with all the points of view, and to see if we can come up with some salient points that make us feel good, that there's still a good relationship, we're still going to move forward. I think we got a lot of good ideas. I appreciate the effort of the moderators and the panelists and our keynote speakers for what they've done and the effort they put in and the knowledge that they imparted on all of us, which I think is good. There are a lot of big questions that still remain. I don't know how many feel that we have a path forward that's bright and shiny and we know how to get there. Is anybody? And we're still kind of scratching our heads, I think, right? We still have a ways to go. But by the way, that may be more an issue of human nature than it is just of this particular moment in time with U.S. and Canada relations. I think a lot of good things did come out of this conference, a lot of positive feelings. It's clear, by the way, it's clear. Nobody should leave thinking for a moment that the U.S. does not like Canada, that U.S. citizens have an axe to grind or are angry. I don't believe that. There are issues. There are political issues and there are economic issues. Giuselino pointed out, there's a different perspective in the way you look at tariffs. There's a different perspective in the way you look at how do you solve a problem, how do you view the problem. And maybe if we were able to view the problem differently than when we came here today, then we've learned something and we've gained something, and perhaps that's going to lead us to resolution. I do think Canada and the United States are intrinsically bound together. We're neighbors, we're not going anywhere, we can't move, we're stuck with each other, and we like each other, and we can depend on each other. So, all right, things are shaking up a little bit. We do have a mercurial person in the White House. There's no question about it. I don't even think Jameson knows what Trump's going to do tomorrow with tariffs. Nobody does. So anyway, I just wanted to say again, thank you for attending. I wanted to again thank our sponsors, Our gold sponsor, the Consulate General of Canada in Detroit. Silver sponsors, Richard W. Pogue, GRL Engineers, Pile Dynamics. Our bronze sponsors, Quebec office in Chicago, Baker Hostetler, Baird in America, Formica Corporation, Taft Stettinius and Hollister, Yormik Law. And finally, our community sponsors, Aero Montreal, British American Chamber of Commerce, Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Council of the Great Lakes Region, Global Aero Industries, Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group, the Northern Ohio District Export Council, and the Ohio Aerospace Institute. Everybody came together. I think we held a great conference. I think we all learned a lot. Let's go forward with our eyes open and our minds open, and you know, be open to solutions. So, unless there's other further business, yes. Okay, yes, there is a trade conference in the fall. Just so you know, why don't you tell it? Do you know the date?
We don't have a date yet, but
Yeah.
this year the conference promised a lot because we're going to be forecasting, we're going to be diagnosing what's in the courts, what's going on in D.C. We're going to bring lawyers and judges of the Court of International Trade, and we're going to forecast what are going to be the big issues for the coming years.
Thank you, thank you. So, no further business. We're adjourned until next year. By the way, one last comment. Next year's conference, April 16 and 17, right? I think it's April 16 and 17. Yeah, so put it in your calendar, mark it down, lock it in stone, and we're now adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.